Imagine a world cleaved in two, a planet fractured not by natural disasters, but by the invisible yet formidable force of ideology. Imagine a world split not by geography, by continents drifting apart, or by towering mountain ranges, but by ideology. A world where belief systems become battle lines. In the aftermath of World War II, as the dust settled and the global order was being redefined, the United States and its allies emerged as champions of democracy and capitalism, advocating for individual freedoms and free markets. They envisioned a world where nations could determine their own paths. In stark contrast, the Soviet Union and its partners, a coalition of nations bound by a shared ideology, vehemently pushed communism, a system promising equality but often delivering oppression. They sought to spread their influence across the globe. This ideological standoff, this clash of titans, became known as the Cold War, and it gripped the world in a state of perpetual tension for nearly 50 years, shaping global politics and international relations. It was a war fought not with conventional weapons, but with spies operating in the shadows, propaganda campaigns designed to sway public opinion, and relentless economic rivalry, as each side sought to prove the superiority of its system. All the while, the world lived under the looming threat of nuclear weapons, a constant reminder of the potential for global annihilation. At the heart of America's approach to this unprecedented global challenge was a strategy known as containment, a comprehensive strategy designed to stop communism from spreading beyond its existing borders. The intellectual framework for this strategy was first proposed by diplomat George F. Kennan in 1947, and its primary objective was to block Soviet expansion, preventing the further spread of communist influence. This was to be achieved without direct military confrontation, avoiding a potentially catastrophic war. Kennan, a keen observer of Soviet society, believed the Soviet Union would eventually collapse from its own internal contradictions if its outward influence was effectively contained. To achieve this, the U.S. aimed to support vulnerable nations, bolstering their resilience with political, economic, and even military aid, providing a shield against communist encroachment. Europe, still reeling and devastated by the immense destruction of the war, quickly became the main battleground for this global strategy, a continent divided by ideology. The continent's shattered economies, its infrastructure in ruins, and its people exhausted and displaced, made it fertile ground for the seeds of communism to take root and spread, promising a new order. The US and Soviet Union, once wartime allies united against a common enemy, now faced off across a divided Europe, separated by what Winston Churchill famously called the Iron Curtain. Containment, at its core, wasn't about aggressively rolling back communism from the areas it already controlled, but about strategically holding the line, preventing further expansion, and waiting for the system to crumble from within. In this global chess game, America positioned itself as the defender of free peoples everywhere, patiently hoping to outlast the Soviet system, believing that its inherent flaws would eventually lead to its demise. But the fundamental question remains: looking back through the lens of history, did containment truly work? Was it a successful strategy that ultimately contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union? Or did it simply accept a divided world, prolonging a dangerous and unsustainable status quo? To answer these complex questions, let's delve deeper and carefully examine the evidence, weighing the successes and failures of this pivotal era. As the dust settled after World War II, the United States found itself facing a new kind of conflict: the Cold War. The policy of containment, aimed at preventing the spread of Soviet influence, became the cornerstone of American foreign policy. The first real-world test of this strategy came swiftly, in 1947. The situation in Greece and Turkey presented an immediate challenge. Greece was embroiled in a bitter civil war, with communist insurgents threatening to overthrow the fragile government. These insurgents, backed by the Soviet Union, posed a direct threat to the stability of the region. Simultaneously, Turkey was facing intense diplomatic and military pressure from the Soviet Union, which sought to gain control over the strategic Turkish Straits. Britain, traditionally a major player in the region, was exhausted and financially drained by the war and could no longer provide the necessary support to Greece and Turkey. The mantle of responsibility was shifting. President Truman recognized the gravity of the situation and responded decisively with what became known as the Truman Doctrine. This doctrine was a landmark declaration, pledging the full support of the United States to any nation resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures, a clear signal of America's commitment to containing communism. To put teeth into the Truman Doctrine, the President requested and Congress approved a substantial aid package of $400 million for Greece and Turkey. This marked the first major implementation of the containment policy in action, a tangible demonstration of American resolve. However, American policymakers quickly realized that military aid alone wouldn't be enough to stem the tide of communism. The widespread economic desperation and social unrest across Europe provided fertile ground for communist ideology to take root. And so, the Marshall Plan was conceived, a truly massive program of U.S. financial aid designed to rebuild the shattered economies of Europe. Over the next 4 years, billions of dollars flowed into Western Europe, fueling reconstruction and development. This influx of capital played a crucial role in reviving struggling economies, modernizing industries, and restoring a sense of hope and optimism to war-weary populations. The Marshall Plan proved to be a resounding success, sparking what many historians now call Europe's post-war economic miracle. As prosperity returned, the appeal of communism diminished, and democratic institutions were strengthened across Western Europe. The United States extended the offer of Marshall Plan aid to all of Europe, including the Soviet Union and its satellite states. However, under pressure from Moscow, the Soviets and their Eastern European allies refused to participate, effectively dividing the continent. In doing so, the Marshall Plan became an incredibly powerful tool in the ongoing ideological struggle between the East and West. It demonstrated to the world that capitalism, with its emphasis on individual freedom and economic opportunity, could deliver a better life for its citizens. These early initiatives, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, laid the foundation and set the tone for America's broader Cold War strategy for decades to come. Containment, as it evolved, was understood to be more than just military might and strategic alliances. It was also about winning the hearts and minds of people around the world through economic assistance, cultural exchange, and the promotion of democratic values. As these policies took shape, the world watched with bated breath as the U.S. drew its line in the sand against the spread of communism, setting the stage for a long and complex global struggle. Despite early successes, containment quickly hit limits. The Soviet Union solidified control over Eastern Europe after World War II, installing communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and more. Churchill called it the Iron Curtain, a stark division across Europe. For millions behind it, containment failed to protect their freedom. The U.S. avoided direct confrontation, unwilling to risk another world war. Eastern Europe became a Soviet buffer zone, its resources serving Moscow. The West accepted this division, focusing on preventing further expansion. Containment was defensive, not liberating. The Iron Curtain stood as a symbol of containment's limits. The continent was split, and the wound would last for decades. For many, this was the policy's greatest failure. The policy of containment, designed to prevent the spread of communism, faced significant challenges. Its inherent weakness was brutally exposed in Hungary in 1956, a pivotal moment in the Cold War. The Hungarian people rose up, yearning for freedom and self-determination after years of Soviet domination. They bravely fought for their liberation, hoping for tangible support from the West, particularly the United States. The U.S., through platforms like Radio Free Europe, had actively encouraged resistance and democratic aspirations behind the Iron Curtain. However, when Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest to crush the uprising with overwhelming force, the situation changed dramatically. Despite the pleas for help, America ultimately did nothing militarily to intervene. The ever-present fear of escalating the conflict into a full-blown nuclear war with the Soviet Union kept the West from direct military intervention. Thousands of Hungarians died in the fighting, and many more were arrested or deported. The hopes for a free and independent Hungary were brutally shattered, leading to a wave of refugees fleeing to the West. 12 years later, in 1968, a similar scenario unfolded. Czechoslovakia's Prague Spring, under Alexander Dubček, introduced a series of reforms aimed at creating socialism with a human face, bringing a brief period of hope and liberalization. But again, the Soviet Union, fearing the spread of these reforms, responded with military force, leading a Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. This invasion brutally ended the Prague Spring experiment in freedom and reform. Once again, the West watched the events unfold with concern. However, They remained unwilling to risk a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union that could potentially escalate into a nuclear war. The policy of containment in practice meant accepting the existing status quo and Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. For those living under Soviet control and yearning for liberation, this was a bitter betrayal of their hopes and aspirations. These tragic events highlighted the limitations of U.S. power and influence in the face of Soviet resolve. They also underscored the immense cost of avoiding direct military conflict with a nuclear-armed superpower. The underlying message was undeniably clear. The division of Europe, symbolized by the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall, would remain a stark reality. Containment, while preventing further Soviet expansion beyond Eastern Europe, would not be sufficient to break the Soviet Union's firm grip on the nations within its sphere of influence. Nowhere was Europe's division clearer than in Berlin. The city, deep in East Germany, was split between East and West. West Berlin thrived, while East Germans fled in droves to freedom. To stop the exodus, East Germany built the Berlin Wall in 1961. Barbed wire, concrete, and armed guards. The wall became the ultimate symbol of communist oppression. The West protested, but did not intervene. President Kennedy declared solidarity, but the wall stood firm. It was a stark admission. The West could not reunite Berlin. The wall showed the world that communism needed force to survive. For containment, it was both a failure and a grim validation of the ideological divide. The wall would stand for nearly 3 decades. In Western Europe, containment found its greatest success. The creation of NATO in 1949 united the US, Canada, and Western Europe in a military alliance. An attack on one was an attack on all, deterring Soviet aggression. NATO's presence froze the front lines of the Cold War. The Soviets never dared invade a NATO country. NATO also fostered stability, allowing Western Europe to rebuild and prosper. West Germany was reintegrated as a key ally, preventing old rivalries. Over time, NATO grew stronger, a voluntary alliance of democracies. Unlike the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact, NATO was built on shared values. The alliance kept the peace and protected Western Europe for over 40 years. This was containment's greatest achievement. The Marshall Plan's impact went far beyond reconstruction. It encouraged European nations to cooperate, laying the groundwork for the European Union. Western Europe became a prosperous bloc, while the East stagnated under Soviet control. The contrast was striking. West Germany's economic miracle versus East Germany's shortages. The US had offered aid to the East, but Stalin refused, fearing loss of control. This decision doomed the Eastern Bloc to economic isolation. The West's prosperity became a powerful Cold War weapon. Kennan's theory proved right. The Soviet system, unable to compete, began to rot from within. Economic strength, as much as military power, was key to containment's success. The Marshall Plan's legacy was a thriving, united Western Europe. It showed the world the advantages of democracy and capitalism. Containment's victory was slow and patient, not sudden. For decades, the US and its allies held the line, enduring crises and moments of détente. The Soviet system's internal weaknesses grew. Its economy lagged, its people grew restless. By the 1980s, the USSR was in crisis. Gorbachev's reforms came too late. In 1989, revolution swept Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed soon after. Containment's goal was never conquest, but to outlast the Soviet system. The strategy worked. Communism retreated, and Europe was reunited. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with the collapse of the East. Decades of patient pressure had paid off. Was containment in Europe a failure? The answer is complicated. For millions in the East, it meant decades of oppression and division. The West's inability to intervene in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or Berlin was a moral failure. Containment was defensive, accepting a divided continent. Yet, its successes were monumental. NATO shielded Western Europe and the Marshall Plan rebuilt it. The West flourished while the East stagnated. Ultimately, containment achieved its main goal, stopping Soviet expansion and waiting for the system to collapse. It was a costly, morally ambiguous strategy, but it worked. Europe is now free and united, a testament to the long, patient logic of containment. The Cold War ended not with war, but with endurance and resolve.